Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out this morning. I appreciate you being here as well. It's my pleasure today to make public the Auditor General's performance audit report collecting government revenues, which was recently submitted to the Legislative Assembly. As Acting Auditor General, I am following up on the work of the former Auditor General Alistair Swarbrick, who delivered this report as he was leaving his post. I have with me today Mr. Martin Rubin, the audit principal responsible for the OAG's performance audit practice, and this audit in particular. I will start by making some opening comments, which will be followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions about the report. The collection of government revenues in the Cayman Islands is a very important function of the government. The government generates about $650 million of revenue in 2013-14 from the multitude of sources. Approximately 95% are authorized by legislation, such as customs, duties, immigration fees, work permit fees, etc. The remaining 5% revenues, which involves the sale of goods and services, are authorized annually through the approval of the government's budget documents. Over the last 5 years, revenue has grown by approximately $175 million, or about 36%. With this significant growth, the government has had the responsibility to ensure that revenues are not only collected in accordance with the laws and regulations, but that they are collected efficiently and effectively. We recognize the challenges government faces in carrying out this important function under these conditions. We address this topic because the effective collection of government revenues ensures that it can have the resources to deliver the programs and services expected by the residents of the Cayman Islands, and that the way it is collected is done fairly and consistently. Therefore, the objectives of this audit was to determine whether the Cayman Islands government is adequately collecting its revenues in order to meet its own objectives. This audit focused on the most significant revenue sources for government, as well as a few others that we considered important to the success of government operations. In total, we reviewed 18 revenue sources from government, assessing how well government is collecting the amounts that should be collected according to the laws and policies of the government, as well as the efficiency by which they are being collected. In reviewing the 18 revenue sources, we essentially looked at approximately 74% of the total amount collected. In addition to conducting a general review of the management control framework, assessing the systems involved in the collection of revenue, and reviewing a sample of revenue transactions, we also carried out an in-depth review of the government's practices for granting revenue waivers of all kinds. By carrying out this wide scope of audit work, we are able to cover most of the significant activities associated with government's responsibility to efficiently and effectively collect its revenues. I would like to now turn to the key findings from the audit. First of all, government is generally doing a good job of collecting the revenues it's mandated to collect. We found that government is collecting the revenues it should be collecting according to the laws as well as authorities provided to it in the budgetary process. There were some exceptions noted that we identified in the report, including an overly complex arrangement for the determination of work permit fees, as well as some issues with collecting duties at the wrong rates. Overall, though, I would like to say that our audit found that government is collecting its revenues according to the laws. However, we found that government is missing many opportunities to save money by doing the job of collecting revenues more efficiently. While we did not quantify the savings to government, we identified several examples in the report where the collection of revenues could be carried out using less resources and less time. As well, the government's practices could lead to additional risks of errors occurring due to the additional steps being taken in the process of revenue transactions. For example, we found government departments operating revenue collection in silos. They established revenue collection practices and systems for their own department, which resulted in lost opportunities for efficiency. Many of the revenue systems we reviewed operate outside the government's accounting system, IRIS. and don't have any automated interfaces that could have been easily implemented. Instead of automated accounting routines, accountants have to prepare and post manual accounting entries, taking time away from other work they could be doing. We found some systems with similar information in them, but operating separately. Again, an opportunity to become more efficient and save the government money. Another obvious area where the collection of revenues could be more efficient is the customer interface on the main floor of the government administration building. There are 12 to 15 wickets operating, with each one staffed by different departments and operating at different times. Observing their operations, many of the individuals are idle for long periods of time. Again, opportunities for efficiencies have not been pursued. The requirement for customers to visit more than one wicket to pay government fees when they visit the building results in more time being spent by the customer and a diminished customer experience. The report includes our observations that the government lacks systems for the risk management and performance measurement for the collection of revenues. These findings have been made in previous reports relating to other government functions such as procurement and the management of major capital projects. These important management practices ensure that government operates efficiently and effectively and provides assurance to senior management that they are achieving the results expected by the Legislative Assembly. These frameworks are fundamental to good public sector management, and we again identified these important deficiencies in this area of government's operations. As most of you are aware, government officials can waive collection of revenues in certain situations. We expected government to be managing this process very carefully, given the risks associated with this kind of activity. We found that government officials have not been acting in accordance with the Public Management and Finance Law, whereby proper systems and practices are required to be in place for the management of public resources. We were surprised to find little in the way of policies, procedures, and practices around the assessment of requests by the public for waiving of duties. In carrying out our audit work, we were only given supporting documentation for 70% of the samples we chose for review. For those waivers which we provided documentation, it was unclear in many cases why the waivers were granted. Government doesn't track how much it grants in waivers, leaving it unable to provide proper financial reports required by its own accounting policies. I'm dismayed at the lack of proper record keeping for this important role in the Ministry of Finance. No one knows how much revenue has been lost to the public purse or whether government officials and politicians have acted improperly by forgiving certain revenues. No one will ever know because senior government officials failed to discharge their duties required under the PMFL. In responding to our recommendation that government establish a proper revenue waiver process, I was dismayed again when I saw that they are estimating it will take until December 2016 to rectify this very critical deficiency, continuing to risk government resources and leaving the revenue collection operations open to abuse. This, in my opinion, is unacceptable. In conclusion, this report on government's responsibilities for collecting revenue has found government doing some things well and some things poorly. For the most part, government is collecting the revenues it is due when legislation requires it to do so. In certain areas, as stated in the report, we say they are doing a pretty good job. However, by leaving the practices associated with the revenue waivers open to abuse, I can't help to think that much more needs to be done to meet the public's expectations for what is a very fundamental government operation. I used the word dismayed when describing how I felt about this serious matter. I must say that when an auditor uses such language, it is only to say that I really am hoping that it encourages government to take action much sooner than it indicated in their response, and to provide the kind of management expected by the Legislative Assembly and the public. Thank you for your attention to my opening remarks. At this time, Mr. Rubin and I will now take questions about the report.
Ben Mead, Cayman Weekly. I noticed in the report you identified 4 agencies as being the largest revenue collectors: Customs, SEMA, General Registry, Immigration. Of those, was anyone found to be performing more adequately than the others, or any lagging behind? I didn't have time to go through the entire report.
In regards to that, we found them all fairly consistently, as I've indicated in the collection of revenues, that they are doing a fairly good job overall in collecting them. Some of the duties we had recorded, they were not in accordance with the laws and regulations, and therefore, but that was very minimal from what we saw from the large sample that we took. And it was as a result of certain changes to the regulations that amount was not recorded properly as the proper rate. If you have any other comments.
Just in direct answer, though, to your question, we don't rate the departments or ministries that we review. So, as the acting auditor general said, we really just assessed each of them against the criteria that we had for the audit and reported our findings. And as we said, there were some issues in each of the areas that we looked at, and we've reported those, and they're included in the report.
Okay, I was just looking if one was a case study for best management practices. And before I pass on, with regards to government acting outside the PMFL, we constantly hear this. What can be done legislatively to tighten this, to ensure that when officials, elected or otherwise, continue to breach the very laws they're elected to uphold or appointed to uphold, that something can actually be done?
Thank you. In regards to that, I think part of it is really government, in this case, when reviewing collecting of government revenues, it's more the systems and practices that were not in place, especially when considering waiver of government revenues. And so we were expecting, the PMFL talks about the importance of just having proper systems and practices for the financial function in place. We were expecting that would have been undertaken by the Ministry of Finance officials.
As well, we looked at the overall government framework for setting up controls across government. We would have expected government to have a standard set of control frameworks in place for collection of all revenues, instead of leaving it to each department to determine how they should do it. So as a result, you end up with certain situations where there's gaps in the control frameworks, and that shouldn't happen if government took a more global approach to setting up those control frameworks that are required to be put in place by the PMFL.
April Cummings from Radio Cayman. Could you speak a little more to the issue, and I realize your focus is revenue collection and improving efficiencies there, to the customer service experience as a possible benefit of addressing these issues?
Again, when looking at, I guess just even the front page of our report shows the government administration building. When you first enter there, you have, as I mentioned, 12 to 15 wickets, each one of them collecting separate revenues. And so for the customer coming in, their experiences, first of all, you have to find which wicket you need to go to pay for whatever fee you want to pay. So there's a bit of inefficiency there. And then if they have to pay several fees, they have to go in line in several different lines. Whereas our expectation and hope would be that you would have these clerks, revenue clerks at each of the wickets being able to collect fees from across government, and that the systems that they have in front of them will be able to recognize the proper revenue collection of those fees.
Joe Avery, Cayman 27. I was just wondering, do you have any inkling of what kind of money was left on the table through all these waivers and I guess missed collections? Is there any way to quantify that at all in a general term?
From the work that we've done and indicated, we weren't able to get any conclusive evidence of how much could have been waived in regards to revenue waivers.
And in terms of duty waivers and waivers from officials, what were some of the examples of the types of duties that were waived? Is there any one specific thing that stood out as something that was getting consistently waived, or was it basically a smorgasbord of all the different things that they could waive?
I'll let Mr. Rubin answer that one.
Sure. Yeah, the government waives all sorts of revenues. We didn't, because of the lack of information that was provided to us, incomplete record keeping, we couldn't really even tell, for that matter, how much revenue was waived in different areas. So in answer to your question, we saw waivers for duties, we saw waivers for all sorts of fees that government collects, but in terms of saying where the majority are, we can't say anything because we couldn't complete our work in that area because of the lack of documentation.
And does that lack of documentation carry over to a lot of your assignments or inquiries? It seems like every time I come down here, they're like, well, the record keeping was so bad, so we can't put a dollar figure on that. I mean, is that something that, is kind of the underlying current of all these audits that you guys perform?
Yes. Again, I guess, excuse me, the word that I used, I was dismayed at the lack of proper record keeping for this important role in the Ministry of Finance. I think that kind of describes why we are dismayed at times with the lack of record keeping, as we found even in the recent report that was held in Public Accounts Committee with the schools building project. There was, again, a lack of proper record keeping there that at times made it difficult to make the proper assessments and information that we would need to undertake the audit. Again, as we've mentioned, no one knows exactly how much revenue has been lost to the public purse in regards to the revenue waivers.
Charles Duncan with the Compass. Can you give us a couple more examples of these waivers and kind of, which departments and a little more detail on that?
Well, if you go through the report, we've listed the front of the report, the kinds of revenues that government collects, and really waivers can be, as we understand the process, can be waived in any one of those areas. So there's no one, if you're asking, where it happens, it can happen. As we understand it, the current policy is that waivers can happen in any area of government's operations. The question, what we were looking for were clear policies and practices with regard to how those requests for waivers are processed by government, and we looked for clear policies, clear documentation of how that happens, and that's where we found that it was simply an approval process that was in place. Who approves these waivers, but no documentation as to how they actually go about assessing whether or not those waivers should or should not be granted. And that is a significant part of a government process that should be in place, which we would hope to that the government will put in place in the near future.
Just in regards to that as well, I think when thinking about government waivers, government may grant such waiver requests as a strategy really to provide economic stimulus to various businesses and industries. And so that's the purpose or use behind them as well. And as Mr. Rubin has indicated, what we had seen too is requests are made through typically the Ministry of Finance and forwarded to the minister, and then requests under $25,000 basically can be approved by the financial secretary, and over $25,000 by cabinet. So I think it's important just to understand a bit of that process, but as Mr. Rubin has indicated, we found really a lack of policies and procedures around that, the policy for granting waivers, process to assess as well. How do they go about assessing? Is there like a checklist to make that assessment or not? And then documentation for waivers that have been granted, part of that record keeping that we had already discussed.
And is your feeling that this is always a subjective review versus like an objective?
Without proper guidance, without proper means to assess, it becomes very subjective, and that's what we're concerned about.
Just a quick question to help clarify things from my perspective. Related to, you mentioned the centralized accounting system that's used, and we know that there are a variety of government departments using, different ways of doing things. But it's likely that there's a cost in integrating anything that can often take more time and money than people realize. Could you speak to that a little?
Yes, currently there are some systems that are integrated within the government's accounting system called IRIS, Oracle Financials. Basically, but we found a lot of revenue collection systems seem to exist outside, and so the accountants have to prepare manual journal entries from these other systems to put into IRIS so that they can see the full picture. Without them doing that on a timely basis, government can't see the full picture of revenue collection of government's revenues of what's come in. And so I think it's important that they really look at how can these other systems be integrated into IRIS.
So do you think that the benefits will outweigh the potential cost, not knowing what that cost is at this point?
We believe government should find that out and take appropriate action. So in other words, it's the way that the systems have been developed over time has been, without the kind of central direction we would have expected to see. So I think it'd probably be a good time to assess whether or not there's efficiencies that could be gained by integrating those systems, in answer to your question.
Hey, Rory McDonough from the Cayman Reporter here. I noticed in the report you were saying that we needed a integration of various things into the IRIS system. The risk management, considering the amount of, this is a similar question to the last one, but considering the amount of assumptions that are made, what recommendations can you make for government to reduce, not reduce, but be able to, forgive me.
It's okay.
It's early for me today.
Wait, are you looking for
able
like,
to manage
the risks
yeah,
associated?
the risks.
Right.
Like, what can they do to essentially get more information? What would you recommend to them to be able to do that, to integrate it into IRIS?
Okay. Just in regards to that, we did have a recommendation around there. The government, as we indicated in recommendation 2, should implement a formal risk management framework that includes the identification and assessment and prioritization of risks related to basically revenue objectives. And so that was one recommendation we've made. I'll let Martin just continue to discuss really about the management framework there.
Exactly. The risk management is an area that we have discussed with government over the last number of audit reports, and it's a fundamental part of government public sector management that we believe is essential to ensuring the efficient and effective delivery of government programs and services. It ensures that government does the right things in the right way. So we have encouraged government in many areas to do this. When we looked at the revenue collection processes, we would have expected again to see government having a robust risk management framework to ensure that revenues that are being collected are meeting the objectives of government. I think that's what you were trying to ask about. And so what we have, whenever we see the impact of a missing risk management framework, we bring it up in our reports and bring it to the attention of government as part of our recommendations.
Another question. I noticed in the report that we did not have a good understanding of how many passengers were coming through the airport. How and why is this possible, and what can be done to what recommendations can the Office of the Auditor General make to the government to?
Yeah, I think in regards to that, there's quite often what was happening is there's reliance on the manifest basically from the airlines of how many people were on the airplane debarking from the airplane into the Cayman Islands, but we didn't have, the government doesn't seem to be using the two systems, that coming from the airlines plus the immigration system, and linking those together to see, are those numbers really matching? Is this the correct amount of individuals coming in to the Cayman Islands?
Any other questions? Well,
No.
with that, we'll close off our media conference today. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and for asking the questions. And please look forward to looking at our report on our website.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yep, thank you.